Hi, this is Danny Ryan, and welcome to the Three Will Podcast. Today I've got Kirk Liemohn here with me. Kirk is a principal software engineer for Three Will. Thanks for joining me, Kirk.
Hello, good to be here.
Great. I'm pulling you in for today's, we're going to hit a technical subject today. And that subject is web jobs. These are Azure Web Jobs, is that correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about what this is, sort of maybe a little bit of history of how you've solved this problem before in the past, some of the benefits of the way you're taking your approach today. So tell me a little, maybe just starting at a high level, what is an Azure Web Job?
It's just a task that runs in the background on Azure within an Azure app, and you can use it to just to run anything that might take a long amount of time, maybe, or just something that you want to run on a periodic basis.
Great. So, what would is there an equivalent type of thing on SharePoint as far as the way you would approach this?
Yeah, so in the past, in SharePoint, we would do a timer job, definitely,
Okay.
and if we had access to do that. You can't do that in SharePoint Online, but so you could write your own timer job in SharePoint. You could do a scheduled task on a Windows server as well,
Okay.
or even a client machine if you wanted to, and those are ways to do it in the past. And I've got a Unix background from back in the 90s, and back then it would have been a cron job. So.
Excellent. So sort of the history of the way that you periodically ran a piece of software, or
Yep.
you also I know when we were talking about prepping for this, you also mentioned that you could use this for long running processes as well.
Yeah. So say if you've got a website, especially if it's running in Azure and it's you've got it and you're using the PaaS solution for doing websites in Azure, and it needs to do some processing, and for whatever reason that processing takes more time than you want to make the user wait. So even if it's just a few seconds, might be enough to say, hey, let's do this asynchronously. You could push it off to a web job, or if it certainly might take minutes or hours, you would want to consider a web job. So for background processing. So it may not necessarily be something you do on a scheduled basis. It may be initiated by a user, but if you were to, in that website, try and spawn a thread so that the user didn't have to wait that delay, IIS, if you're using IIS, it'll potentially kill your thread, because it thinks, well, I've already returned to the user, and I don't need to be having anything else going on. I see there's something else going on, but I don't care. I've already returned control to the user, so it has no use for your thread you've created. So that it's better to do something like a background process via a web job.
So tell me a little bit about some of the things that you learned while doing this. I guess talk a little bit about how did you package this up and get it on Azure?
Yeah. So first off, this is my first time doing a web job, and I've wanted to do them in the past. I've had some times I didn't have to do them, but I kind of wanted to do them. This is a time I really needed to. I am doing a migration to Office 365, and we're concerned about throttling. This is a SharePoint migration, and we know that we might get throttled by SharePoint Online. So we want to know when we're being throttled.
Okay.
And so the best way we can do that is to look at the logs from the migration tool and read that information and find out if there's an entry in the log that indicates that we're being throttled. So I've got several migrations running at once on several servers. I didn't want them to each go through and look for this, because it is a little costly. I have to do a full text index of the content and a query across that. So I've decided that I want to run on a periodic basis a job that will do that check, and then it'll post something to a simpler database that says, yep, I've been throttled or not. And so it'll be a lot easier to, say, create a dashboard that shows what the throttle status is, if there's been any throttles recently, as well as the migration, these servers that are doing migrations, they can do that check and say, oh, if we've been throttled recently, I don't want to start another migration job. I'm going to hold off until I've got no throttles within the last hour or something.
Awesome. And how are you alerted about this? So you mentioned a dashboard. I guess you could do it through a dashboard, but how else?
Yeah, so I haven't created the dashboard yet, but
Okay.
I might do that. But what this job does right now is it's I don't know if I answered all your question. I use Visual Studio is what put it into
Okay.
the Azure Web Job for me. I started out making it as a PowerShell script, and my PowerShell script relied on a commandlet that for SQL that I had to use actually three MSIs to get that working. And I didn't know how to install MSIs in a web job, so I don't think you can. You can upload a bunch of files, and it was simpler for me just to switch it over to a console app. So I switched to a console app. This console app was written in Visual Studio. Visual Studio was real easy to just right click on the project and say create or publish as web job. And there's a few settings you have there, how often you want it to run, and then from Azure, the Azure console, admin console, you can kind of see the status, like any output from your console as well, your console app.
And you mentioned that this runs every hour, but that's primarily because of the type of Azure account that you have. Is that correct?
That's right. So this will run. I have it running once an hour, but that's the fastest I can have it run since we're on the basic. I think it's the basic plan for our Azure web app. If I were to change that to standard or premium, I could do it more often. And we may do it for that reason. We haven't decided that we need to go to that level yet. But that is correct. But while it's running, it simply does the query, the full text query against SQL, which is running on an Azure machine. So I have to have the access to that SQL server kind of over the internet. So I've got special accounts and ports for that. And then if it finds something, it will log something to a different database table, and it will also send an email. And I use SendGrid for that, which I've used SendGrid in the past with Azure, so it was pretty easy to set that up.
So it's pretty easy configuration for that.
Yeah, it probably took me 30 minutes, and I hadn't used SendGrid in several months, so maybe a year. So it wasn't fresh in my memory, but about 30 minutes to figure out how to send an email, basically.
Awesome.
And set it up and configure it and all that.
It's funny. You mentioned this is the first one you've done. I think that's the best time to give advice to other people who might be doing this for the first time. Any other pointers that you would give to people for writing Azure web apps?
Well,
web jobs.
Yeah, web jobs. So the first thing is trying to understand what it relies on. So if it's relying on certain other pieces of software or something installed on your system, then it may not be appropriate, or you may need to find ways to get those up into Azure. So if you need other files, in my case, initially I needed some other commandlets for PowerShell, and that wasn't going to be the easiest path for me. So just doing a all-encompassing console app that knew how to talk to SendGrid and knew how to talk to databases was all I needed.
It's funny. It seems like console apps are coming back, because I was talking to Chris yesterday, and he wrote for the migration tool, the Jive to SharePoint migration tool. That's as a console app as well. So it seems like they're coming back in fashion nowadays.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and all of our stuff for migration is mostly PowerShell based, and we run all that from consoles, and so definitely. So yeah, just trying the gotcha is just trying to understand what your program relies on, trying to understand what your needs are in terms of how often this thing needs to run, and those are kind of the two things that I ran up against.
That's great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you're busy on your project, but hopefully this will help somebody who may be out there looking to write their first Azure web job.
Sure.
So thank you for doing this, Kirk.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.